Hey everybody, KMO here. So yesterday, I took the opportunity, I've been showing my son who's visiting, I've been showing him films from the 80s, or in the case of Alien, 1979, it's almost the 80s, it's the transition. And there's a film from the 80s, which is a genre film. As I understand it, it was pretty well liked and well regarded. I still see images of the poster from time to time, even in 2020. That film is Krull. I'd never seen it before. I thought, hey, since I'm showing my son films from the 80s, let's watch one together that I haven't seen. So we put it on. And it sucks. It looks terrible. So I'll have more to say about Krull and its place in 80s cinema. But first, I first mentioned 80s cinema in a video from a few days back and got some nice comments on that. I'm going to read one from you. This is from First. First writes, "It was explained to me by a late boomer that the 1980s media was so good due to the conclusion of the relative instability of the 1970s. With the peaks of unemployment and the oil crisis, the 1980s reflected America's first techno-optimist successes over the limitations that appeared in the 1970s for civilization. I believe the Club of Rome published their work in 1974 on limits to growth. Well, the 1980s seemed to break all those limits. Gas was relatively cheap again, and the boomers found new fortunes in the finance boom. Also, the amount of global space launches peaked in the 1980s as well, I think. A lot of movies were about tech or space reaching new levels, whereas a lot of movies/media from the 2010s reflected exclusively collapse. Hunger Games, The Walking Dead, etc. The movies of the 1980s really reflect the spirit of the time, and that spirit was on a different plateau than it is now." And that's very interesting. I was a teenager in the 1980s, and Nicholas Meyer, who directed Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which I'll come back to because that's an important film from the 80s, he later directed a film called The Day After. It was a made-for-TV movie. The effects weren't from ILM. They didn't look nearly as good as Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, but, it was a film about nuclear war and what life would be like here in the U.S., on the ground, for normal people, in the aftermath, the day after the nuclear war. The idea that we could all die in a civilization-ending, possibly extinction event, nuclear holocaust that could take place at any minute was, an omnipresent reality for people living in that time, particularly for people like me who were, forming our lifelong impressions at that time. I'm not going to dwell on, life in the Cold War, my experience of it, just to say that, there was a lot going on culturally in the 1980s, which was surely reflected in film. But a lot of films take a long time to get to the screen. So, for example, last night, I watched again with my son 1981's Escape from New York by John Carpenter, which had a budget of $6 million. Krull, which came out 2 years later, in 1983, the year that Return of the Jedi came out, had a budget of $40 million, and yet the optical effects look like dog shit. It's just terrible. It looks so bad. And yet Alien, a film from a couple years earlier, still looks great. Why? Because there were very few optical effects. Most everything was done in camera. Stuff shot on film, physical objects that were on set, in frame, caught on film, 40 years later still look good, if not great. Whereas blue screen effects from 1983, not done by Lucasfilm, look terrible. Mocha, go away. Go on. There you go.
She sounds kind of mad.
Yeah. She didn't want to be moved, but so it goes. So here's another take on why movies from the 1980s, particularly the genre films that I like, are so much better than the ones now. This comes from 6 Sigma 6, who writes, "They are better. They have better plots and targeted at IQ 90 instead of today's IQ 65. So here's an example of a piece of crystallized knowledge in my head, something I learned many years ago, which was true at the time, and which arguably is no longer true and needs to be updated, even though I'm still just tossing it off like it's fresh information. This is the Flynn effect. A researcher noticed that over time, IQ scores were rising, about 3 points per generation, and it held through most of the 20th century. I had no reason to think that that pattern was no longer in effect, and yet, First linked me to a couple of articles which indicate that IQ scores are now falling. And this is mostly from a Norwegian study with a very large data set, which is why it's impressive. But it basically just demonstrates that the Flynn effect is no longer in effect. IQ scores are no longer rising. So, yeah, maybe there's something to that. Why is that? Who knows? My guess would be digital technology. But, that's not even a hypothesis. It's more of a supposition. I'm not attached to it. Okay, now, back to Krull. Krull came out in 1983. Again, this is the year Return of the Jedi came out. There's a few things in Return of the Jedi that don't look so good anymore, but for the most part, visually, it totally holds up. Whereas Krull looks terrible. I mean, it doesn't look like there's $40 million on the screen. Where did that money go? I'm not sure. A lot of it went into the optical effects, surely, but they just look terrible. I mean, they really look awful. Like an episode of Doctor Who from that same era is not appreciably worse. The cast were mostly British stage actors. They brought a certain gravitas to the role. There's some decent acting in it, but the screenplay is terrible. It is just boring. It is slow and boring. But here's the thing. John Carpenter, who wrote and directed and also scored Escape from New York, he was 34 years old when that film came out in 1981. The budget was $6 million. Compare that to $40 million for Krull. $6 million was the budget for this film. He was 34. He had written the script, though, in 1976 when he was in his 20s. And really, it was inspired by Nixon and Watergate. I mean, that's really the era and the concerns that are reflected on screen in 1981 in Escape from New York. But, what's it got going for it? One, the passion of the director. I mean, this was a project, he had written the script before he did Halloween. Halloween was the success that made him, that gave him the option to do films that he wanted to do, not just any work he could get, to make rent, basically. And so when he had that freedom, that his previous success had given him, he went back and he pulled his passion project off the shelf, Escape from New York. So one, you've got the writer and director are the same person. He also wrote the score. It was a passionate project he'd been working on for years. It had been in his mind for years. And it's got a great cast. It's got a cast of aging former action, I don't know what to say stars, but actors who were known for physical roles, action roles, like Lee Van Cleef from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He plays the chief of police of the National Police Force. We've got Ernest Borgnine, who had done World War II action films. He's playing the cabbie. Harry Dean Stanton, who had been Brett in Alien just a couple years earlier, plays Brain. What's her name? Adrienne Barbeau and her breasts play, the chick. So it's got a compelling cast. It's a passion project. It's low budget, but here we have a director who's basically, he's just getting started in his career. And this is his passion project, and this is his opportunity, to make a real film, a big budget film. Because Halloween was such a low budget production, it was lightning in a bottle. And other directors with much bigger budgets have been trying to recapture that, that original lightning in a bottle experience of Halloween for decades and failing, consistently failing. So, 1979, when Alien came out, Alien had a budget of $8 million. Just a couple more than Escape from New York. Now, at the time in the late 70s, that wasn't considered a low-budget film. In fact, the original budget was $4 million, and Ridley Scott, who is also a painter and an artist, he started doing storyboards for it. When producers and studio people saw Ridley Scott's storyboards, they got excited, and they doubled the budget from $4 to $8 million. Still, just a few years later, Krull gets a $40 million budget and can't come anywhere close to matching anything about Alien. The acting, the atmosphere, the writing, certainly not the visuals, not the sets and the monster effects. So another thing that Alien had going for it was Jodorowsky's Dune. Alejandro Jodorowsky had gathered this group of creative people around him in Paris to do pre-production for his version of Dune, and that included Dan O'Bannon, who wrote the script for Alien, as well as Mobius, the French comic book artist, who did production design and character design, costume design for both Dune, the one that never got made, and Alien, and also, most importantly, probably, H.R. Giger. Maybe not most importantly. I would say most importantly is Dan O'Bannon, who wrote the script for Alien, because Ridley Scott, unlike James Cameron or John Carpenter, doesn't write. You know, he's a visual guy. He's a photography guy. He's a visual composition guy. He is an artist. He doesn't write his own scripts, which is why, you know, when it's announced that he's going to do a new Alien film, there's no guarantee that it's going to be good, because he didn't write the first one. He doesn't understand how to write dialogue. He doesn't understand how to pace a film in terms, you know, at the screenplay level. He doesn't get it. So he has to rely on other people for that. Sometimes they come through, sometimes they don't. And, you know, when it's Damon Lindelof writing your script, no surprise that it doesn't come through. It doesn't happen. So, speaking of James Cameron, Aliens came out in 1986. I was 18 years old. At the time, James Cameron was 32. Again, he both wrote the script and directed it. So it was his vision from the ground up. And it had a great cast. I mean, it had really excellent actors. You know, obviously Sigourney Weaver, but also Lance Henriksen and Michael Biehn, Bill Paxton, Paul Reiser, you know, a comedian up to that point, but comedians have this amazing ability to go from doing stand-up and light comedy to serious dramatic roles. I don't know what that chemistry is, but comedians often make the leap from stage to screen very well. So now, Krull. What's wrong with Krull, other than the bad effects and the lackluster screenplay? Well, Peter Yates, he was 54 at the time, 2 years older than I am now. Again, this film came out in 1983, same year as Return of the Jedi, the year after Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. This was a freaky thing. James Horner, who wrote the soundtrack, you know, who wrote the score for Wrath of Khan, also wrote the score for Krull, and I kept expecting the Krull soundtrack to break into those familiar Kirk and Khan themes from Wrath of Khan. And there are apparently a couple places where he did just completely lift stuff from that film score from a year before for Wrath of Khan and reuses it in Krull, but not the main themes. So that was a kind of freaky experience. One, to have such an excellent soundtrack paired with such lackluster imagery. But this was Yates's first sci-fi fantasy film. Before that, he's best known for action films, thrillers. He did a film with Steve McQueen called Bullet, which featured one of the best early car chases. And he didn't want to be known for that. He wanted to, you know, broaden his repertoire. So he wanted to do this genre film. He had no background in it. It wasn't his vision. He was a guy hired to come on, you know, and direct this project, which was trying to cash in on, you know, Star Wars and all the other films I've been talking about here. You know, the successful genre films of the early 80s. This was a studio effort to bring a big budget to that and a lot of professionalism to it. And what they produced was, it just sucked because there was really no reason for it to exist. Somebody was tasked with writing a screenplay. They found a director. They found a cast. They were looking to create a commercial product, and there was no vision behind it, as far as I can tell, you know, beyond the conceptual design. I can imagine that, you know, some passion and some love and some real creativity went into the visual design of the film, but the visual design alone, you know, without good pacing, without a compelling script, without a reason for us to care about what's happening, I mean, the design alone can't save it. So when I watched Krull, I was just thinking, this doesn't look like a film from the 80s. Yeah, the effects look like they're from the 80s, but just the shots, the composition of the shots, the pacing, it seems to be of an earlier, you know, decade. And it looks like it's from the late 50s or the 60s. Why is that? Probably because Peter Yates, the director, you know, this was near the end of his career. He didn't do that many films after Krull, and he certainly didn't do any films after the 1980s. And so I think that his cinematic, visual, aesthetic sensibilities were pretty much set in stone coming into the 1970s. And so, you know, he might have directed a big budget film in the 80s, but it doesn't look like a film from the 80s. It doesn't feel like a film from the 80s. It doesn't match the expectations that I have when I think about films from the 80s. Although I need to pause here and say there was a lot of crap made in the 1980s. For every excellent film that we remember from that period, there were a million low budget, low effort, low skill attempts to replicate that. And most of them fail. And I know this because there was a theater near where I grew up called Brywood. Brywood was the dollar theater. And, you know, their films weren't exactly first run. They'd been out a few weeks in full price theaters, and then they come to the dollar theater. My friends and I, we were teenagers. We had lots of time to kill. We had cars. We could always scrounge up $1. I missed out on the opportunity to see Nine Inch Nails because I couldn't come up with $8 one time. And I was a big fan of Nine Inch Nails at the time. But I could always come up with $1 to go to a movie at Briarwood. And so we saw everything there. Everything. And a lot of it was absolute garbage. But it was garbage with heart. After the first couple Halloween films, the first couple of Friday the 13th films, first couple of Nightmare on Elm Street films, these series continued on because they were cheap to make and there was a reliable audience for them. They made money. They weren't blockbusters, but, they were good enough to keep making them. Hellraiser is the ultimate example of that. First couple of films had heart. They had vision, and thereafter it was just a formula to be cranked out to make a little bit more money, and they got worse with each iteration, but they kept making them because the finances worked. They were cheap to make, they made a certain amount, it was a pretty much guaranteed return, and even when it gets to direct-to-video, the economics of it still works. So there's a lot of crap from that era, but it seems like the films that worked, they worked really well, and they worked in a way that can't be replicated today. Now, yesterday I put up a video of my friend Alex talking about it, and he went to film school, he studied the history of film, and so he thinks about it in terms of, one, the evolution of filmmaking technology. For decades, there was no sound in movies, so there was a formula that worked, and it was a formula that filmmakers had discovered and honed over decades, and then sound comes along and changes the dynamic entirely. So, you get movies basically become radio plays. I don't remember the name of the director, but I was watching a video recently that referenced this director who was, an early film director when sound had just come in, and he didn't even look through the lens of the camera. He didn't look at the actors on set. He just came and sat down, closed his eyes, and listened to the performances to figure out, whether to do another take or whether the one that they just did is what he was looking for. Because at that point, once sound was available, once sound was an element in filmmaking, they basically pulled from the talent pool of radio and radio drama to inform how to make films for a time. The technology got better, and the process of making films, it picked up, it acquired a life of its own, and it evolved. But as the craft of filmmaking evolves to adapt to the evolving technology behind filmmaking, the audiences and their understanding and their ability to follow film and their ability to appreciate it was also evolving. And in fact, like Stanley Kubrick, he had it in his mind to make the film which eventually Steven Spielberg made called AI. He had that in his head for many years. And he waited and waited and waited because he realized that the filmmaking technology was not available to bring his vision to the screen. And it wasn't until he saw Jurassic Park that he thought, okay, now the technology is here, now we can do it. But think back to Jurassic Park. I don't know what year that was. It was in the early 90s. It was the first really impressive use of CGI, computer-generated imagery, to depict objects that were supposed to be taken as real, as being on set there with the actors. So with Jurassic Park, this is the cue to tell other filmmakers, this technology has matured enough to where you can bring it into a serious film, and it will work. It will look right. Now, CGI ages badly, very badly. Sometimes stuff that's only 5 or 6 years old looks really out of place when you view it, through eyes which have been accustomed to the latest achievements in computer-generated imagery. And yet Jurassic Park holds up. There was a BBC documentary series called Walking with Dinosaurs. That's also from the 90s. That still holds up. I mean, if you look at it, if you know CGI and you look at it, you can see the limitations that they were working with. But they mixed it with, live action settings. They just sent camera crews out into the world to find locations for the scenes they wanted to depict. And they do an excellent job of matching the lighting, of matching changes in the environment there to the movements of the animals, like if they're splashing through water or moving through foliage, things like that. And even today, like I say, it looks better than a lot of stuff that's just a few years old, or even stuff that's brand new, but which is, like, one thing I've heard about why CGI doesn't look better than it does is that it's used so ubiquitously throughout the entertainment industry that the effects houses that do it are just slammed with work. They just, have to boom, 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 crank it out, get it done, get on to the next project because there's so much work to be done. Which I think a lot of filmmakers understand that CGI doesn't age well, that it doesn't look good. And so back in 2011, there was a sequel made to John Carpenter's The Thing, another great film from the 80s. Now, the beautiful thing about The Thing, and I showed The Thing to my kids last year when we were staying at a hotel. We had a big screen TV in the hotel room, and we watched The Thing, and it's all in-camera, visual, practical effects. So when they went to make the 2011 sequel, they actually hired an effects company to do practical effects, practical creature effects, and they shot them, on site, on set. And then the studio executives looked at the dailies, they looked at the initial results and thought, that looks kind of dated and weird. Let's do it in CGI. And so they did. They hired a CGI company, an effects house, to redo all the practical effects in CG, and it looks like you'd expect. It looks like just standard, crank it out, nothing special, CGI, and now it's 9 years old, it doesn't look good. Whereas I wish there was a director's cut with finished practical effect work, or practical effects work enhanced with strategic use, strategic supplementation with CGI. I think that was the original plan. But with just run-of-the-mill CGI effects, it looks like basically what it was, an attempt to wring some more money out of a 1980s cult classic film by John Carpenter. So that's my explanation as to why I think Krull, which had a budget that exceeded the budgets of Alien, Aliens, and Escape from New York combined, looks like crap. It's because the director was from a different era. He didn't have a vision for this. He just didn't want to be confined to the genre that he was known for, which was, suspense films, thrillers. All right, well, I've been jabbering and repeating myself, so I'm going to bring this one to a close here, but that's where I am right now. That's where my head's at. I'm thinking about movies and how we as audience members also evolve in response to the way movies are changing. And movies change in response to, the expectations that studios have about what audiences want, but also in response to changes in technology. And also, the larger cultural zeitgeist gets picked up and is reflected on screen and, crystallized in these films. And so, I won't get into the current zeitgeist. YouTube is full of examinations of it. But there we go. I will talk to you again later. Stay well.